Okay. All right. Hopefully this is working. Check again. Testing one, two, three. Okay. There we go. 29 October. This and that information. Dussel on Marx's economic manuscripts of 1861 to 63, chapter 4. We've looked at some diagrams, which we are referring back to from prior chapters 2 and 3. Having a little trouble here with the page reloading. Come on. Let's try it again. Testing one, two, three. Testing one, two, three. Testing one, two, three. Testing one, two, three. Still having trouble with the microphone. Hang in there. It appears as if it's picking up, but let me try again. Testing one, two, three. Okay. Well, it seems to work as far as it needs to. All righty. Anyway, here we go again. Oh, welcome. 29 October. This and that. Dussel on Marx's economic manuscripts of 1861 to 63, chapter 4. As I said, I've included the earlier diagrams from prior chapters, and we'll get more diagrams in chapter 5. I'm not sure we'll get to chapter 5 today, so we've got to finish chapter 4 first. And 4 is the critical confrontation with Stewart, Steuart, and the physiocrats. But there's a front end to this part of the text, and that is part 2, critical confrontation of the system of categories as a whole. That is, and as Dussel has described it before, there was this little break in the reading between which Marx is looking at other matters. And I think you can see it in this diagram. In other words, August 61 to 1862, that covers the front end. And then he goes on to write notebook 6 to 14 of the theories of surplus value. Afterwards, he writes further notebooks 15 to 18. And so that's kind of, and then notebook 5. So that's kind of where this is notebook, this is theories of surplus value essentially. But this is part 2 of Dussel's text, critical confrontation of the system of categories as a whole, the so-called theories of surplus value. In March 1862, Marx abandoned notebook 5, at least on page 211 of the manuscript. For on this page, he quotes Times edition of 26 November 1862, footnote 1. Possibly the last part of notebook 5 might have been continued in January 1863, when Marx started writing notebook 19, as we will see in part 4, chapter 11 of Dussel's book. In any case, in March, Marx began notebook 6, which up to and including notebook 15 form half of the manuscripts of 1861 to 63, and which bear the title Theories of Surplus Value under the number 5. MECW 30, page 348, because point 4 must have been either the comparison between, as we looked at before, in chapters 2 and 3, the comparison between absolute and surplus value, or the problem of accumulation according to prior plans, footnote 3. If you can stick with me there. The thesis that Marx wants to clarify here had already been discovered in the Grundrisse and would later become the main theoretical perspective of all this third part, or theories of surplus value. It reads as follows, quote, all economists share the error of examining surplus value not as such in its pure form, but in the particular forms of profit and rent. What theoretical errors must necessarily arise from this will be shown more fully in chapter 3, footnote 4, in the analysis of the greatly changed forms which surplus value assumes as profit. So profit is this intermediate, we get to profit before we get to rent, I suppose, if you want to think of it that way. The fundamental questions that must not be forgotten during the development of this second part are, first, the type of errors or confusions into which bourgeois economists fall, and second, the necessity of such errors, necessarily arise if one considers that capitalistic political economy is imprisoned within the bourgeois perspective of everyday life. In other words, economic science is contaminated from its origins or presuppositions with a necessary deforming ideological interpretation, which is unavoidable and unescapable. In other words, there's context for our fiddling around here. And it is this relation, and problematically read. I mean, obviously, the critique of political economy, it is a critique of political economy that is what Marx is writing. These notebooks from 6 to 15, the theories of surplus value, TSV, are not a history of the theories of surplus value. Marx speaks for the first time in April 1867 about such a history as Book 4 of Capital, where the topics of the three preceding books, that is volume 1, 2, and 3, were to be repeated as a historical form. In other words, it's possible to view Capital, the text, as volumes 1, volume 2, volume 3, and then the putative volume 4 is kind of the history of the theoretical elements represented in 1, 2, and 3. Now, that may seem unnecessarily complicated, but kind of the way he does it. And it's not unusual or new in that context. Footnote 5. As we shall see, the purpose of these 1862 notebooks was not to make a history. Neither are they a theory of surplus value, because this had already been partially developed up to Notebook 5, that is, in this book by Dussel, chapters 1 through 3. In fact, Marx interrupted his prior discourse in order to perform a precise theoretical task, that is, to confront his discoveries up to March of 1862, the categories already constructed, especially surplus value, critically. To confront it critically with the categorical structures of the most important and relevant bourgeois economists prior to him. This would be a generic confrontation between two paradigms: the recently discovered and growing system of categories of Marx himself with those of the classical economists or others pertaining to the prevailing economic theory. It was not only an issue of settling accounts, it was a prior issue. It was, in fact, a critique, a matter of comparing, testing, launching his hypothesis, and evaluating his capacity to answer and to test other economists and himself. With this confrontation, almost a struggle of theoretical boxing, Marx will not only demonstrate the force, the resistance of his categories already constructed, but will also be forced to develop new categories. This critical confrontation of theories plural, of categories, hence neither a history nor a theory of surplus value as such. So, in other words, there are three things, there are histories, theories of surplus value, and the confrontation, as I think you want to think of, is this dialectically as triadic in that sense. Anyway, neither history nor a theory, but a confrontation. Was of great importance in Marx's intellectual biography. His theoretical hypothesis and his interpretive categorical structures, his essentially abstract economic political paradigm, economic-political paradigm, shall get the approval, the green light of this test, a critical test, not as a conclusive or explanatory argument, but as one which endures the enemy's attack. So this is hypothesis testing in that context. Confrontation, which slowly develops into the possibility of performing a critique of other categorical paradigms. Marx had exerted this type of critical confrontation many times before. In the Grundrisse, there is a booklet, which is a true anticipation of the 10 notebooks which do comprise theories of surplus value. It is a work of many pages, which starts, like many others, from these notebooks 6 to 15 from the manuscripts of 1861 to 63. Quote, the economists, plural, absolute confusion, quote, the distinction between profit and surplus value does not exist for him, that is Ricardo, proof that he's clear about the nature of neither one. So he's being a little sarcastic, I would suppose, close quote. This booklet is a good example of how Marx sometimes leaves or interprets his discourse to make some sort of a quote-unquote escape, an unexpected trip of critical confrontations which slowly intertwine themselves and constitute an independent work within the former. At the end of this long comment, he exclaimed in French in the Grundrisse, now back to our subject, just like what I do, which he could have said when returning months later to his notebook 5 prior to notebook 19. So it's a little convoluted, as you might imagine. We're on page 45 now. As one can see, both in the Grundrisse as well as in the whole material used to write the first 5 notebooks of the manuscript of 1861 to 63, Marx first tried to differentiate between surplus value and profit. But between these two terms, a huge practical and theoretical space was opening in economic reality, in a great number of categories which had to be clarified or constructed, in which Marx now had to begin to confront classical bourgeois economists. In a certain way, after Marx discovered for the first time in the history of the political economy the profound category of surplus value at the level of production, the essence of capital, it was now necessary to pass over or go beyond Übergehen from the perspective of this category to the category of profit. As one could not directly pass or go beyond from labor, time, or value to the measurement of the value of the commodity without the mediation of money, so also one cannot directly pass, because many mediations are required, from surplus value to market price, if profit and surplus value are taken as identical. A great many confusions evidently will appear. Non-clarity is a necessary consequence because the terms are identical. In order to differentiate the mediations, the terms of the relation had to be differentiated previously. The passage from surplus value to profit is one of manifestation. That is, value appears as price of production. The passage from profit to surplus value, that is the obverse, is one of foundation. That is, price is founded in circulation from surplus value. So we're kind of looking at this set of mediations between production and circulation, and we're looking at the kind of dynamic movement of price of price and surplus value and profit, and vice versa. So the bourgeois economists grant absolute priority to the passage of profit to production, profit arrow production, right-hand arrow. Marx cannot deny the necessity of this first passage, namely the one of realization, but he articulates it explicatively from the first one. He cannot deny the necessity of a theory to explain the necessity of a price of production, the only fundamental problem in the eyes of bourgeois economists, since they analyze everything from the quote-unquote perspective of capital. But Marx, who analyzes everything from the subject of labor, the point of view of labor, namely from the laborer's perspective, from the working human being, because it is an essentially ethical, not only a moral perspective. Footnote 6 is interested in founding price on value. That is, objectified human life on surplus value, that is, stolen life. So founding price on value, objectified human life, that is, it's human objectified human life, on surplus value, that is stolen life. He thus founded the superficial and phenomenal level of circulation on the profound and essential level of production. Department 1. Thus, critical confrontation is necessary in order to prove to himself that his genetically new paradigm can resist the attack of the old scientific ideological bourgeois paradigm, because all social science, even Marx's, of course, always has an ideological component. Marx's position is not ideologically free in that sense. Always has an ideological component because it cannot pretend and is denied by its nature to be the absolute knowledge, social science without ideology. Hence, Marx worked hard with a passionate theoretical enthusiasm from March 1862 to November of the same year on these 724 pages, from page 220 of Notebook 6 to 944 of Notebook 15. MECW 30, page 347 to MECW 32, page 543. At the rate of almost 100 pages per month. Now he had to resort to the British Museum's library, where up to the present time, we can still consult the same works read by Marx. Well, now that they moved the building, probably not. Anyway. Damn it, I lost page 46. Christ. I forgot to do that. Hold it a second and I'll see if I can find page 46. Oh my. I apologize. I knew I'd skipped something. Um, Crap. Hang in there. Haste makes waste. All righty then. Figure 4.1, the profound essence referred to just in the last sentence is surplus value. The form of manifestation is profit slash or dash rent. So essence and form. So that's kind of what he's thinking about. And we'll see this in, of course, the diagram above, that is figure 4.1. The form of a manifestation is profit dash rent, as we shall see, is a form derived from surplus value itself. The question is to articulate in the phenomenological or apparent level the various necessary mediations of surplus value. The problem, although introduced very much in advance, is illustrated in 4.1. So you can see here the price of the number one, the categorical mediation one, is cost of production. Then the thing that is the price of the commodity derived from production costs, that is cost price, wherein you're trying to make some relation to other things like the market value. And then after that is surplus value, then average profit, then price of production, which is cost price. Also, it's kind of a repeat where you can think of it as a kind of weird subsumption in that sense. Then market value itself, and then market price, which is not identical to market value, and then finally profit, which is number 8 here. And I know that's a little convoluted, but you have to think of these things as these little circuit things. So anyway, the problem, although introduced very much in advance, is illustrated in figure 4.1. Although it's not our desire to explain these 8 levels of profundity, because this would be the result of Marx's critical confrontation with the bourgeois economists, we would like to point out only a few aspects so that one can understand from the beginning the categorical clarification and constitution performed by Marx, beginning in Notebook 6. Methodologically, one must pass from the abstract to the concrete. The most simple and abstract, in this case, is surplus value. And the profit is the more complex and concrete. So this is the contrast, right? Surplus value is abstract. Profit is a little more complicated and is concrete. Labor time in production from a critical standpoint determines the product and its value. That is levels 1, 2, and 3 here, right? While from competition in general, or considering capital per se, and not actually as many capitals from supply and demand, which should be considered in the second of the 4 parts of the treatise of capital in general, footnote 7, the price of the commodity is determined. So you need to think of this as sort of smaller internalized cycles in that sense. We must now mention that Marx can perform the passage from surplus value to profit thanks to 2 categories, namely average profit, that is level 4, and cost price or cost of production at level 5. So we're looking at the difference between calculating the costs at one level of production, which is probably more like formal subsumption, and the second price roll up, the second cost price of production is as it moves toward a more generalized or concrete or real subsumption. So that's kind of described there, although I'm not sure whether you could you'd be misrepresenting it if you referred to it as the difference. You can see that the difference in cost price, the 2 cost prices, are essentially the differences that correspond to formal subsumption and real subsumption. I know that's kind of complicated, but we'll go back over this. Just as circulation was the ontological totality in the movement that founded money's function, now competition, this is circulation and competition, right? Now competition will be the foundation from which the determination of the cost price or price of production is made a concept, which is still blurred for Marx in a great deal of the manuscripts of 1861 to 63. And I would assert, and I think it's not too far off, to assert that in the context of manuscript 64 to 60, 1864 to 65. But anyway, we'll get back to that. Marx's originality lies in the fact that for him, contrary to classical political economy, surplus value is, in its essence and totality, equal to profit at an abstract level. But in order to explain concrete variances among capitals, branches of capital, or nations, other categories are required. So you have this kind of formal set of relations, but in order to get it into, create its, to fully realize it as a materiality, other categories are required. Hence, surplus value can be higher or lower than the average profit. On the other hand, the cost price or price of production can be higher or lower than the market price. Now, from the foregoing, one can derive important conclusions regarding the dependency issue, which is very important to Dussel, speaking of in terms of Latin America. Since the price of the products which allow extraordinary profit in central as opposed to peripheral countries contrasts with the lower profit and lower price of dependent countries. So in this context, in the Latin American context, there's center periphery, right? Just as we have global north, south at a different level, different scale, we have you have center periphery, which is not identical to, but resembles for a variety of reasons, settler colonialism, etc., global north, global south. In the same manner, in developed countries, the average profit will be greater than the surplus value itself, and it will be the opposite in underdeveloped countries. So it's a relative measure, and is variegated in that particular sense. Now, one last comment before approaching our. Let's see, we're still in the forward or the introduction to chapter 4. We're not even at chapter 4 yet. One last comment before approaching our subject matter. One might ask why Marx deals with so many issues under the title of theories of surplus value. Yeah, why is that? If one studies the problem further, however, one can see that from an external historical framework in the form of a chronology, Marx advances in the investigation of many subjects without this prior order, although sometimes at a distance from the issue of surplus value, as in the case of Stuart, the physiocrats, or Adam Smith, or as opposed to surplus value, or productive labor, which produces surplus value, or rent, in which surplus value is distributed, etc. There's a lot going on there, and this is why Stuart is important in that way. In this way, the unexpected problem of reproduction, footnote 9, goes through all critical confrontation. No, remember, this is confronting stuff as opposed to a single moment. In any case, the development of the concept of surplus value is what unifies all these notebooks and constitutes the great category discovered by Marx. Now, critically confronted with the errors and confusions of classical economists because they ignored this category. Now, this is let me break here for a second and say, with all due respect, this is kind of what Sheikh is doing when he goes to the classics, where he reinforces this set of relationships because it is a confrontational relationship, which is less explicit, let's put it that way, or underdetermined, let's say, in certain newer interpretations for Marx. But anyway, they had to ignore it necessarily due to their blindness resulting from their position within the totality of the bourgeois perspective within a world in the Hegelian and Marxian sense, which phenomenologically can be easily related to Hegelian and Marxian sense, which which also depends. Let's start this again. They had to ignore it necessarily due to their blindness resulting from their positions within the totality of the bourgeois perspective within a world in the Hegelian Marxian sense, which phenomenologically can be easily related to Heidegger's sense, which also depends on Hegel, founded on the capitalist being, that is, value which valorizes itself. Outside this being, nothing makes sense, including living labor, the source from which Marx performs this confrontation. Finally, beginning of chapter 4. So at this moment, we have another 15 minutes or so, and that we're not going to get to not going to complete this chapter today. So either we stop now, or we, and I apologize for that missing page, but we're going to look, we can just begin this because we'll probably have to look at it again. Well, I will anyway. On chapter 4, this is Dussel, right? Economic Manuscripts of 1861 to 63 by Marx. Critical confrontation with Stuart and the Physiocrats. Notebook 6, pages 220 to 243, started in March 1862, MECW 30, pages 347 to 76. But it does, this is Marx, but it does, quote, but it does not appear in this form with the Physiocrats, because they have not yet reduced value in general to its simple substance, the quantity of labor or labor time. Their method of exposition, the Darstellungsweise, is, of course, necessarily governed by their general view of the nature of value, which to them is not a definite social mode of existence of human activity, that is labor, but consists of material things. So this is that difference between material activity and material activity and material things. That is land, nature, and the various modifications of these material things. Close quote. So he says, we might get to the end. Now we've still got a ways to go. In this short chapter, we wish to have especially an explicit epistemological attention. That is, in order to describe the method used by Marx in his, as we looked at before or suggested, his confrontations. You know, how else could it be a critique, right? Confrontations with political economists. With capitalist political economists. In subsequent chapters, we shall not be able to undertake the subject in detail. Hence, we must clarify here this specific level of Marx's discourse. 4.1, the case of Stuart. Deep down, J. Stuart has a mercantilist conception. Quote, before the Physiocrats, surplus value, Mehrwert, that is, profit in the form of profit, was explained purely from exchange, the sale of commodity above its value, close quote. Now, Marx started to pay attention to the categories used by Stuart and discovered the fundamental structure of his paradigm. That is, surplus value obtained in the sale upon alienation is profit, but by no means is surplus value, as Marx had defined it in the first notebooks of these manuscripts of 1861 to 63. So it's not identical. From Stuart's point of view, surplus value and profit are identical. They're just two names with the same semantic content. According to Stuart, there's only one name, profit. Consequently, there is only one positive profit, which increases or expands the social wealth, the sum of use values, a greater amount of value, surplus value or profit, which is produced in consequence of the development of the productive powers of labor. So the real value, according to Marx, the value of the product, or the creation of new wealth, is the result of a certain quantity of labor, which, as an average, a worker of the country can normally perform. This relationship between labor and value is correct, but Stuart does not ask himself how it is possible to have new value or more value, that is, value in excess, surplus value. He cannot explain or clarify the origins of this particular capitalist surplus value. But the really essential question, which is the one Marx is interested in, comes after these categorical distinctions. So, when the product is sold as a commodity, the relative profit, which represents a loss to somebody, is obtained for the manufacturer capitalist adds over the real value and determine an extra something more, the price of the commodity. Stuart's new category is greater than the real value, thus achieving during the sale a relative profit. This is the capitalist profit, which is a loss for the buyer. Marx says that Stuart understood well that the distribution of relative profit pertains to dominant classes, that is, profit to the manufacturers, interest to the lenders, rent to the landowners. So there is this thing in all three sectors, that is, land, labor, and capital. He also understood clearly that all profit is surplus value of the price of the commodity over the real price. He also had a correct conception of capital when he discovered how the separation takes place between the conditions of production as the property of a definitive class and labor capacity. But essentially, Stuart could not understand at all the question of surplus value as Marx conceived it, because he never overcame the perspective of circulation. In fact, when Stuart asks himself about the complements of real value, indicates three: quantity of labor, value of means of subsistence, and value of materials. Now, these three components, articles, Stuart calls them, three components, cover up or do not show the surplus value in Marx's sense. The quantity of labor is the labor performed by the worker, as opposed to what we were looking at before, labor power, right? Or that required to reproduce labor capacity, while the means of subsistence, or that required to reproduce labor capacity, as Marx would say, are in fact part of the quantity of labor. It would be performed in necessary time, but not in surplus time. Now, to sum up, from his confrontation with Stuart, Marx concludes that surplus value is not discovered as such, as objectified surplus labor time, but only under the form of appearance, as Marx would have put it, of one of its phenomena as profit. But definitely, the fundamental error or confusion is the same as that of mercantilism. That is, to assert that a commodity is sold above its value in order to explain profit. It is not understood that it is sold at its value. real value that includes surplus value as quantity of objectified time over the necessary value for the reproduction of the worker's means of subsistence to express ourselves in terms of Stewart's categories. And that may be a little confusing, so we'll come back to that. One must ask what kind of hermeneutical task Marx performed. Marx considered the names and categories within Stewart's mercantilist paradigm and confronted the latter with his own names, categories, and paradigm. As a result, there came out positive and recoverable aspects of a Stewart, while others were rejected as a result of confusing errors. Yes, talk about that. And you can see that some of these confusing errors existed at the level of, as of textual explication. Now, from the perspective in which Stewart placed himself, he is the rational expression of the monetary and mercantile systems, namely from his real, practical, and everyday world. There is no possibility for a national, coherent scientific expression, different from the one expressed by him. It can be perfectly rational or scientific and yet erroneous or blurred. It is coherent within its perspective, which takes circulating capital as the essence and fundamental. His mistakes are thus necessary. Now, that we may have to come back to this simply because there's still a lot to explain relative to the rest of the chapter. So we may actually repeat this tomorrow, and we'll see whether we can get from there to, kind of the development that Dussel is making, moving from the physiocrats, Smith, etc., and you plug in Stewart and, those folks. Interesting that, anyway, so yes, there's a lot of that there. But it's not too much more. And then we'll get to probably tomorrow to finish, because it's also a short chapter, Adam Smith's perplexities. So recall that, we're not doing a history here of Stewart or Ricardo or Smith. I mean, we do delve in a little bit of detail, but you always have to remember that what Marx is trying to do is to put a kind of framework around a frame of one kind around this kind of activity that is obviously not identical to other authors like Stewart, Ricardo, etc., but rather takes from a bunch of them and tries to actually get the language to sort of work amongst them. And of course, Marx jettisons some of those elements. So anyway, I've got to the end for today. Let me thank you for your attention. Let me return to the live stream and